Hello, and thank you for clicking on my video. Now, if you've seen the other videos in this series, you'll know that my name is Alex, and I'm an actor and a writer, and I live here in Tasmania, in Australia. Now, as you can see, it's winter in Tasmania at the moment, so it's quite cold here up in the hills. Fortunately, I'm a mammal, which means that I can regulate my body temperature, so I won't freeze. Unlike reptiles, the snakes in Tasmania, for instance, don't all hibernate, but they do become very torpid or sluggish in the winter. And mammals are very important to this story, which is another story in my Dinosaur Dell series. This story is story number 7, the story of Professor Pteranodon and the curious creatures. Under the volcano. And not too far from the sulphur springs and the pits of tar. In the middle of a forest of tall tree ferns, you'll find some houses where the footpath turns. This is where I live. You can tell from the roars, my neighbours are all dinosaurs. I'm Alex the Alxosaurus. Hello. Now, once upon 70 million years ago... Wait. Which of the stories shall I tell about the dinosaurs living in Dinosaur Dell? The story of Professor Pteranodon and the curious creatures. Now, this story starts where a dinosaur comes to study literature, arithmetic, or law for the prehistoric diploma, for short, the PhD. Just outside the Dell itself is Roxford University, home to clever dinosaurs and pterosaurs like these. Between them, they know everything about the ologies. Here's Professor Pteranodon, brainiest of the lot. She knows more than all those other dinosaurs ever forgot. Tapajara's her assistant, always on hand or wing, if ever the professor requires anything. And the professor requires a lot of help in her library. She has all sorts of books that she uses to help the residents of Dinosaur Dell. On this particular morning, Tapajara was running to and fro, fetching books from the shelves for the constant stream of visitors that came to ask Professor Pteranodon for help, including me. I needed some help with a story, you see. Actually, I ask for her advice and assistance all the time. Life can be awfully aggravating for an author who's always attempting to rhyme.
An ABCdery for Alex the Alxosaurus, cried Professor Pteranodon, and Tapajara came flapping down from the library shelves with a huge book. I'd never heard of an ABCdery, but it was a very useful book with lots and lots of letters. As I left, in came Bob the Brachiosaurus, begging to borrow books about bridges, balconies, buttresses and belfries for something he was building. Then came Constable Compsognathus, confused about a complicated case he couldn't crack. A catalogue of clues for the constable, Tapajara,
cried Professor Pteranodon. He was followed by a distressed and despairing Dr. Deinonychus, who needed help with a diagnosis.
A dictionary of dinosaur diseases for Dr. Deinonychus, Tapajara,
declared the professor. Well, this went on all morning. Professor Pteranodon needed an encyclopedia for Brigadier Euopolocephalus, a folk music fanzine for Florence Fostero Venator, a guidebook for Guru Guaibasaurus, who was off to Gondwana for a holiday, and a history book for Homer the Homolocephale to help with some homework he had. Then it was an inventory with an index of inventions for Corleone the Iguanodon, a journal about juggling for Jason Juxartosaurus, and knitting patterns for Brad Tar Pitts the Critosaurus. And that was all before lunch,
when Professor Pteranodon needed a leaflet about light in landscapes for Leonora da Vinci. After lunch, she wanted a manuscript about menus for Miriam May Asora, who wanted to make some new meals, and a newsletter about nature for Nick Noasaurus. Oisin, the ophthalmosaurus, had ordered an omnibus of ocean stories, and of course, Tapajara had to fetch that too, as well as providing Paul the Parasaurolophus with pamphlets of poems. Phew! For Quentin Quaesitosaurus, Professor Pteranodon needed a quarterly about quiz questions, and Reverend Rhamphorhynchus requested a review of rocks. Then in came Stig the Stegosaurus, seeking a script for a show he'd seen. Tapajara had hardly had a chance to have tea when in trundled Tracy Triceratops, needing a thesaurus, and Thomas the Trigonosaurus needed a textbook on trigonometry. Randy Coprolite Jr., the Utah Raptor, needed a book that was still unpublished. That took Tapajara a long time to unearth. Vernon the vegetarian velociraptor wanted a volume of verses for his Valentine, Virginia, and Will Wurhasaurus wanted a Wimmel book. If you don't know what one of those is, they're great fun. This one was called Where's Wallysaurus? It was getting dark by the time Zanshausaurus came by, asking Professor Pteranodon to explain some homework. Words beginning with X. Well, Xiphactinus and Xenopus are words that would vex a Tyrannosaurus rex, but she managed, though not without the tired Tapajara having to fetch yet more books from the shelves. Tapajara yawned as Madame Yavalandia popped in to ask for a yearbook, and was zonked by the time Zeke Zuniceratops dropped in to check how to grow zinnias and zucchini, which of course needed more books from the library shelves.
"Oh, I feel as if I've been dragged through the alphabet backwards,"
said Professor Pteranodon, which Tapajara felt wasn't quite right, but didn't have the energy to contradict. It was now very late, and Tapajara and the Professor were having their supper. Professor Pteranodon wasn't very tidy, and was always dropping crumbs over the books. Tapajara had had to make some little lizard traps to catch the lizards that wandered in to eat the fallen crumbs. They were very cleverly designed, so that the lizards weren't harmed at all, but a little grating closed after they went into the trap, and they couldn't get out again. Tapajara was always very kind to the trapped lizards, though, and took them to the forest as soon as possible to release them where they'd be much happier, amongst the ferns and flowers. Tapajara had just gone to look in one of the traps, and noticed that Professor Pteranodon hadn't opened the mail that had arrived that morning. She'd plonked it on the floor, where it was now buried under several books and a lizard trap.
"Oh, Tapajara," scolded Professor Pteranodon, "what have you been doing all day whilst I've been busy helping the dinosaurs? We'd better open the mail now, I suppose, although it is very late."
It was just as well that they did open the mail.
"Tapajara, look at this!" cried Professor Pteranodon. "I've been invited to compete for the Nobel Prize."
Now, in case you don't know, the Nobel Prize is the highest honour a dinosaur or pterosaur scientist can win. It was set up a long time ago by a very famous dinosaur scientist, Alfred Ankylosaurus. Why is it called the Nobel Prize? Well, you know what an Ankylosaurus looks like, I'm sure. He's armoured all over with knobbly lumps, so that's why it's called the Nobel Prize.
"Goodness, Tapajara, we can't sit around talking. The competition is next week," said Professor Pteranodon, reading the invitation. "Oh, and there's so much to do. There will be a written exam, but I also have to present a new invention or discovery. Oh, what on earth can I take? You'd better sort through some of my best inventions," she said, as she left for the night. Tapajara was up all night looking through all of the Professor's recent inventions, but none of them seemed quite right for the Nobel Prize to Tapajara. True, Professor Pteranodon had been the first pterosaur to invent the trampoline, but of course it was made of rock, which made for a rather unpleasant landing. And she had invented open-toed gumboots as well,
which did keep your toes nice and cool, but left them perhaps a bit wetter than you'd want them to be. Her wind-powered clothes dryer worked quite well. The wind turned a huge sail, which helped to drive a wooden mallet, which hit a panel that helped pull a string, which operated a lever that turned a large fan that dried the clothes. But it didn't seem quite up to the standards of the Nobel Prize. The professor's discoveries weren't perhaps ideal either. True, she had discovered amoebas, tiny creatures so small you couldn't see them, which was the problem, really, as none of the judges would be able to see them either. And she'd discovered a new substance called white phosphorus, which glowed in the dark. Unfortunately, the moment the air touched it, it caught fire and disappeared. So that wasn't much use either. Suddenly, Tapajara heard a scratching from one of the lizard traps and peered inside. There inside were the most extraordinary creatures. Not lizards at all, but 6 tiny, furry little animals with intelligent eyes. They blinked and chattered as Tapajara looked at them. They huddled together. The 4 small ones, Tapajara guessed, must be babies, and the 2 larger ones their grown-ups. Tapajara had a very kind heart, and didn't like to see them caught in the trap, so decided to let them out in the forest. At that moment, Professor Pteranodon arrived.
"Oh, you haven't been up all night, have you?"
she asked Tapajara. Then she noticed the lizard trap.
"Oh, Tapajara, I thought you were sorting through my inventions, not playing with the lizards, honestly."
But before Tapajara could answer, Professor Pteranodon noticed that the little snouts sticking out of the trap were not those of lizards. They were little pink snouts of a kind she hadn't seen before, with twitching whiskers set below beady little eyes.
"Goodness me!" she cried. "I think I've discovered a brand new animal. Nothing like this has ever been seen before. Whiskers, fur, paws, tails. I never saw such things. Do you know, Tapajara, they look almost intelligent to me. But of course they're just animals, aren't they? Not like you and me. Still, I think a new species of animal will make a most impressive entry for the Nobel Prize."
And she took the lizard trap and the furry little animals in it, and went to show it to the other professors at the universe sortie. Poor Tapajara, left alone, shrugged glumly. It wasn't nice to treat animals like that, even if they weren't as intelligent as a pterosaur or a dinosaur was. Nevertheless, a week later, Professor Pteranodon arrived with Tapajara and the 6 little animals, which she had moved to a cage, at the Nobel Prize ceremony. The cage was kept covered for now. First would be the written exam, and then the judges would look at all the inventions and discoveries the competitors had brought with them. And what judges they were! The most famous Mesozoic scientists you've ever heard of. Alberta Nectes Einstein, Charles Darwinsaurus, and Martha Raptor Chase. Tapajara was still sad about the little animals being kept in the cage, but Professor Pteranodon just said,
"Oh, don't be silly, Tapajara. They're not clever enough to worry about that. After all, they're not dinosaurs or pterosaurs, are they? Just furry little animals."
Professor Pteranodon and Tapajara sat by the cage whilst the exam papers were handed out.
"You may begin,"
said Charles Darwinsaurus, and Professor Pteranodon turned over the paper. Question 1. What do you see once in February, twice in November, 3 times in December, never in May? Question 2. How many 9s are there between 1 and 100? Question 3. What word is always spelt wrongly? Question 4. What gets bigger the more you take away from it. Question 5. Draw a line. Without touching it, make it shorter. Question 6. Vernon the vegetarian velociraptor is asleep when there is a sudden knock on his door. It is dawn, and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Velociraptor, have arrived to have breakfast with him. Downstairs in the kitchen cupboard he has a jar of juniper jam, a jar of ginkgo jam, and a jar of date jam. What will he open first? Professor Pteranodon stared at the questions, open-beaked.
Oh, goodness me! But these are impossible!
She pushed the paper and pencil to one side and buried her beak in her wings.
Oh, I shall never win the Nobel Prize now.
And she was right. I mean, could you answer any of those questions? Could you? They're pretty hard, even for a brainy dinosaur. Well, poor Professor Pteranodon couldn't answer one, and she sat, beak in her wings, for the whole half an hour. Time is up, called Albertonectes Einstein, and came around to collect the papers.
Oh, there's no point,
said Professor Pteranodon sadly. But Tapajara smiled, handing the paper to the judge, and Professor Pteranodon noticed that all the answers had been filled in.
Tapajara?
She asked quizzically. It wasn't me, said Tapajara, and pointed a wing at the little animals in the cage. One of the grown-up ones was still holding the pencil.
Oh, how did they...
I told you they were intelligent, said Tapajara.
Oh, goodness me, then we can't possibly keep them in the cage, said Professor Pteranodon. Oh, that's not kind at all. We must release them at once.
But the Nobel Prize, said Tapajara.
Oh, that's not important right now,
said Professor Pteranodon, and flapped out of the exam hall with the cage in her claws, followed by a delighted Tapajara. They let the little animals go in a small wood nearby, and the animals pattered away with happy chattering. Tapajara glimpsed some more of the furry little creatures waiting for their friends in the undergrowth, and waved a wing at them to say goodbye. The two pterosaurs arrived back at the hall as Albertonectes Einstein was making an announcement. Our runner-up is Professor Protoceratops, who got half the answers in the exam right, and dazzled us with his new invention, the wheel. Professor Protoceratops grinned and showed off his wheel. It was octagonal, so made for a slightly bumpy ride, but it was only a protoceratotype. He could always work on it a little more. Perhaps a square would work better, or a triangle. And the Nobel Prize itself, said Albertonectes Einstein, goes to the only entrant who answered every question in the exam correctly. If she has a remarkable invention or discovery to show us.
Began Professor Pteranodon, looking embarrassed.
Of course, said Tapajara. Here's the professor's invention. And put down the lizard trap in front of the judges. A lizard trap! So clever! Declared Martha Raptor Chase. I'm always eating biscuits whilst I'm working, and the lizards make such mischief, coming in and rummaging through my papers for the crumbs. Oh, me too, said Albertonectes Einstein. But it doesn't hurt them, queried Charles Darwinsaurus, who liked animals very much. Not at all, said Tapajara, and showed him how the trap worked. Genius! Cried the dinosaur scientists all together. Professor Pteranodon, the Nobel Prize is yours. But no, cried Professor Pteranodon, and all the scientists looked at her in surprise.
The Nobel Prize is ours.
And she took Tapajara under her wing and smiled. And that's the end of my story. But if you happen to be studying yourself one day at Roxford University, you might have a class there, where now, it would seem, Professor Pteranodon and Professor Tapajara are working as a team. By the way, did you guess the answers? You did? Oh, well, let me see. Question 1, you'll know the answer is, of course, the letter E. Question 2, how many 9s between 1 and 100? There are 20 of them. Did you guess that? Fine. You must have remembered to count twice for number 99. What word is always spelled wrongly? Well, that's wrongly, I would say. And a hole is one thing that gets bigger the more you take away. How to make the line longer? Well, this question was the worst. Draw a line next to it that's much longer than the first. And since you're such a clever dinosaur, it will come as no surprise. The first thing that Vernon would open would be, of course, his eyes. Here's a little bit more about my story. A lot of dinosaurs appear in this story. I'm sure you'll know many of them already. Of course, there are other animals too. Pteranodon wasn't a dinosaur, but a type of flying reptile, a pterosaur. Although she was the most famous type of pterosaur, there were lots of others, including Tapajara. Tapajara lived about 112 million years ago in the Cretaceous period in what is now Brazil. Tapajara's unusual name comes from a word in Tupi, a native Brazilian language, and it means the old one. Darwinsaurus is a dinosaur with a very complicated history. His bones were first found in 1842 in Hastings in the UK. They were later classified as iguanodon bones. Then, in 2010, they were reclassified as belonging to a dinosaur called Hypsilospinus. In 2012, it was decided that they were, in fact, a new type of dinosaur called Darwinsaurus. Darwinsaurus's name is in honour of the great scientist Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. He helped to develop the theory of evolution, which describes how all species of life are descended from common ancestors, like the way in which birds are descended from dinosaurs, for example. Martharaptor was a therizinosaur who lived in the Cretaceous period in what is now the USA. Therizinosaurs had enormous claws on their hands and were probably covered in feathers. The Martharaptor in my story is the Dinosaur Dell version of Martha Chase, who lived from 1927 to 2003. She helped to identify that a substance called DNA carries genes, which are the things that determine what colour eyes you might have, how tall you might be, and even what type of blood you might have. Albertonectes was a plesiosaur. Plesiosaurs were not dinosaurs, but reptiles that lived in the sea at the same time as dinosaurs. Albertonectes lived right at the end of the Cretaceous period and had the longest neck of any plesiosaur. It was 7 metres or 23 feet long and had 73 bones in it. The Albertonectes in my story is the Dinosaur Dell version of the famous Albert Einstein, who lived from 1879 to 1955. He won a Nobel Prize, one of the highest awards in science, in 1921. He came up with some very important theories about space and time, including the theory of relativity. And you can ask your grown-ups to explain that. There were other animals living in the sea too, like the ichthyosaurs, which were reptiles that looked a little bit like dolphins. Wallosaurus was one of these, which lived in the Jurassic period. Not all animals are so large, of course. Professor Pteranodon knows about the amoeba, an animal made of just one cell. Now, to understand how small that is, Your body is made of 37.2 trillion cells. Amoebas move about by changing shape and can split themselves into two to make more amoebas. But some of the most important animals that appeared alongside the dinosaurs were mammals, which are the curious creatures Tapejara traps. Mammals are now some of the most intelligent animals on Earth, and include whales, giraffes, elephants, lions, bats, mice, monkeys, and of course, humans. But they started out as tiny little creatures like Juramaia. She lived in the Jurassic period in China and was only 100 millimeters or 4 inches long.
Well, thank you for joining me for a story from Dinosaur Dell. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed writing it and telling it. Now, one day I'd obviously like to turn all of my Dinosaur Dell stories into storybooks that anyone can read at home, perhaps using some of the character drawings and photos of Tasmania that you saw on the screen while I was reading the story. I'd love to hear from you, so if you enjoyed the story, or you'd just like to say hello, or even better, tell me who your favourite dinosaur is, please let me know in the comments below, or do visit my website www.alexscottfairley.com, and hopefully I'll see you next time for another story from Dinosaur Dell. Bye for now.